Hello from Hemingford, Quebec, everybody. I'm David Smith, Data Smith on Lichess, and welcome to another Hemingford Chess Club video. So we're halfway through the Hemingford Chess Club Championship, and in Section A, Nils, a newcomer to HCC events, is leading with a perfect score of 3-0. Section B is being led by a Canadian, I'm happy to say. Unfortunately, that Canadian isn't me, but it's Paul, otherwise known as Lifts sometimes. One day I'm going to do a blog or a video on all of our Lichess handles and do a bit of research and find out the backstory behind some of those, because some of those really provoke some questions. In Section C, we've got another newcomer, this time from Sweden, Bengt, who's leading that section with a perfect score. And in Section D, our youngest player, Julian, youngest and also probably one of the most faithful members of the HCC. I guess he's going through one of those massive rating jumps that young players do from time to time. He's got a perfect score in that section. Good luck to all of you in the last few rounds of the tournament. I'm looking forward to perhaps, maybe, picking up at least a half a point somewhere along the way. It would be nice not to go through the tournament without a win, but there you go. Now, this week, I was actually listening to the Perpetual Chess podcast, and I heard a quote from Matthew Sadler, who's an Anglo-French GM and computer scientist, who said that apparently modern chess engines are strong enough in their positional judgment that even if you limit them to a two-ply analysis or only looking forward two moves, that even at that level, the positional judgment is so good that those engines can play at a 2500 FIDE ELO level, which I find frankly astounding to think of it. But it does actually make me wonder how, whether we need to put a little bit more emphasis on our positional understanding and perhaps less on the advice that we get from everywhere, that we should be studying tactics, and more tactics. Anyway, I certainly have a couple of examples from my games of poor positional judgment, and since nobody has come forward to share one of their games this week, you're going to get stuck with looking at one of mine. So, without further ado, to quote Ben Johnson from Perpetual Chess, let's take a look at a position that comes out of my game played last weekend with Vladek Marcos. It's a semi-Slav that we're playing, which is what we always play when the two of us meet over the board. And as you may know, the semi-Slav is an extremely complex chess opening, either, or rather both on a tactical and positional level. And at this point, White has essentially put the question to Black with his last move, which was the pawn from d4 to d5. The threat, of course, is that the center opens up and Black's king becomes quite vulnerable, and either he gets mated or loses material in the process of defending himself. So this position calls for a bit of serious reflection. And despite the complexity of these positions, there are really only a couple of possible moves to consider here, at least. And it's really all got to do with what do we do about the pawn on d5. So Black's choices essentially are to trade on d5, or alternatively to advance to e5 and block the center. And here is, of course, where I made my poor positional choices. What I decided to do is to trade on d5, which leads very quickly to a very poor situation where we'll just trade off the c pawn here. And now the weakness of c7 leads to a loss for Black. Now, this is, relatively easy to calculate to get to this point, and I saw it to this point, but I didn't see any real alternative. I figured that I was going to have to accept that I would take some material loss and see if I could recoup later on during the game. In fact, though, I needed to have given a little bit more consideration to the other alternative in this situation, and that would be the closing of the center here. The actual moves would have gone something like this: trade off the c pawn again to get it out of our hair, and then play e5 and close the center. Now, I was able to see this position, but I immediately rejected it, mostly based on the presence of this white pawn on d5. It's a passed pawn now. It's protected by its own pawn on e4, and it's in the center of black's position. And my limited positional understanding says that this is a bad thing. Fair enough, it is a bad thing. But unfortunately, I was looking at only a single consideration, and that's this strong d5 pawn. Once I saw that d5 pawn, I said, forget it. I'm not even going to look at the possibility of closing the center like this, but I really needed to. And in fact, the engine looks at this and says this position is perfectly fine for black. The reasons, I guess, are the fact that on the queen side here, black has some compensation for that white pawn. These three pawns are facing off against the single white pawn, and if black can get down to an endgame, it's pretty clear that black has a significant advantage on the queen side with that queen side pawn majority. The other key consideration is the fact that with the pawn on d5 here and the center closed, black has now been given a little bit of breathing space, the time perhaps to castle on the queen side, find places, homes for his pieces, who knows, over here, so on and so forth. And the other consideration, of course, too, is that black is a pawn up after all, which is a feature of the semi-Slav. Black typically grabs an extra pawn and hopes to hold on through the attack. So really here, black should have looked at the whole board rather than simply at one small consideration, one small positional consideration. The excuse I'll give you is that this is a complicated position, and so I was confused by the complexity, which is another reason maybe not to play the semi-Slav. So in my next game, a couple of days later, I ended up with the white pieces against Lucas Wasserman, and I decided to play something in which the strategic ideas were very, very clear, and I wouldn't have to struggle with all of that complexity of the semi-Slav. So I played a Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, and if you know this opening, you know that the strategies are typically fairly straightforward for white. And indeed, we've reached a position here where things are quite simplified, and it's very clear, or it's fairly easy to assess where the weaknesses and strengths of each side are. So white has, of course, a weakness or black's weakness at c6 is something that white can target. Not that white's going to be able to target very well, because this knight will come to c4, blocking access to c6. And white will never be able to trade knights on c4, because that would result in the creation of a black passed pawn. The other feature of this position is the open A file, which right now black is occupying, but that there's nothing that should really prevent white from being able to contest by bringing his knight over to a1, his rook over to a1. So that's a nice, clear, simple position, and really white should have looked at this and said, fine, the c-pawn is not going anywhere, so let's solve the other part of the equation here and get our rook onto a1. So that would have been the correct strategy, but what white did instead was calculate. Instead of use positional judgment, I decided to calculate. And knowing my weakness in calculation, that should have been a red flag right away. But basically, I concocted this plan where I was going to sorry, that's not the right one. I was going to bring my knight here, gain a tempo by attacking the pawn on c6, which of course, I guess that's a tempo. Move the queen to c3 to clear the d3 square for the knight. So black plays there. On to c4. Now, I had seen this, of course. I'd calculated all this because I'm such an excellent calculator. The knight comes to c4, and the threat is, or it's a sort of a latent threat, is to come to d2, where there's a fork coming against the two rooks and the b3 square. No problem, though. This is the reason that the queen is on c3. It covers d2. And so white continues by playing the knight here, again with the plan of coming to c5. Coming to c5 and attacking really some meaningless squares. So I'm not sure really whether this was had any real sense to it, but there you go. Now, of course, the problem here is that black has a lovely little tactical resource with this next move. Attacking the queen, X-ray attack on the knight. And if white plays here, then black has this lovely, lovely little decoy exchange. So we exchange on b3. That deflects the queen away from the d2 square. And of course, black's next move forks the queen and the rook, and it's game over for black. So two examples of positional judgment gone wrong, essentially, where really, instead of calculating, I should have taken a more serious look at positions. And in neither case was the positional judgment something that you had to be a grandmaster to exercise. So there you go, a little lesson from my games about maybe the overestimation we all make of tactics, and encouragement to learn a bit more about positional play. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I hope you all have a very good week and enjoy your games. Good luck to you in all of those. If anybody wants to prevent me from having to show another one of my losses, please let me know, and we can sit down and take a look at one of your games. If I don't get any volunteers, I might just have to volunteer one of you myself. I'm looking at you, John. So take care, everybody. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.